I'm Melissa Purley, talking with our guest today, Amber Reed, for the VSGA podcast, Why Wool? And Kelly Audie is on camera and editing today. Amber, thanks so much for having us on your farm. It's beautiful, really beautiful. We're standing here in the middle of not all of her sheep. She's told us she has a total of 80, and we've been to a couple other places and seen them. Amber, thanks so much for having us here. And I'm wondering, I read about you a little bit and that you grew up in West Virginia. And I wondered, did you grow up on a farm?
No.
Or what started all of that?
I grew up in West Virginia and kind of central Maine as well. So my family were all pretty much Italian coal miners, like immigrants. And my mom was sort of wanted to be a back to the lander, so we moved to Maine in the mid 80s, and so then we lived in a homestead.
Oh, wow.
So we didn't farm really, but it was like a big garden, and we had like an outhouse and a spring and some solar panels. It was very like kind of Little House on the Prairie kind of.
And like off grid?
Yeah, and my stepdad, we used to eat like all kinds of weird wild game, like coons and porcupines, and
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, I was really interested in farming always.
From the time you were little?
Yeah, like we'd visit other friends' farms, and so I worked on farms in college and stuff, and then I woofed after college and milked goats in France, and it kind of like caught the bug.
Yeah.
And so from there I sort of embarked on, I was actually a public school teacher for a while. I taught biology and some other stuff, but my passion is definitely working on the land and working with people who work on the land, and so I farmed for a long time. I don't know quite how long, actually. Not that long, really, like 15 years or something. And then I've started working for UVM Extension as a grazing specialist in the last couple of years. So that's been fun too, and different, because I get to meet lots of great farmers all over the state and learn stuff from them too. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And this is these guys were all sheared in October. I don't usually shear lambs, but we're doing kind of an experiment this year, and we sheared our lambs to sell wool to murals, and they do sweaters and garments and stuff. So anyways, that's why these guys don't have very much wool, because my other sheep are like with wool right now.
So it seems that you were a river guide, right?
Oh, yeah.
You're a river guide, and all this stuff. So it seems like your background is a really wonderful eclectic mix of farming education and experience. And so, but now the focus on pasture and grazing, and the move from cattle to sheep. Mm-hmm. So why? I'm curious as to why you are focused on pasturing and grazing.
Yeah. Well, sheep are way cooler, just if anyone's wondering.
True story, everyone, in the sheep and goat.
They're also like incredibly efficient. I just think I say that with joking, but I'm serious. I really enjoy cows, and they're very fun. There's lots of great things that you can do with them, and they are a really powerful tool in pasture. Sheep are a lot lighter. And so there's kind of a different whole set of things that can happen because of their weight alone in their feet. But that said, sheep can produce fiber, meat, and milk, which is awesome. You can graze them under solar panels, and they're not as destructive as goats or cows. They're a lot safer than horses. So anyways, I obviously can't ride a sheep unless you're really small.
Yeah.
I think sheep are also, they're a lot more complicated. So, honestly, for beginners, cows are bigger and more dangerous and more expensive, but they're a lot easier because they don't have the parasite issues that sheep can have. And so I think I kind of got into sheep accidentally. I was managing a farm that was providing a lot of meat for a restaurant, and they wanted lamb. And so we ended up doing sheep, and then it was so interesting. I couldn't stop reading about them, buying them, and getting kind of fully immersed in sheep world. So that's kind of how that happens.
And what about the pasturing? Is that just born from dealing with ovine versus, bovine? I mean, what is why that?
Well, I started my farming, I guess you could say, like, when I worked in France, it's kind of the tragedy of the commons. Unfortunately, a lot of, in some, let's just say some European systems where, like, so the farm that I worked for there was in the Pyrenees, and in the mountains there were these huge, like, alpine pastures, and everyone would just send their goats out, and they would go up and graze, and there was no rotation, there was no grazing pattern. And having done a lot of reading over the years, I wondered about it at the time, but didn't fully, like, understand what was going on there. And then when I came back to the U.S., I ended up working for these very progressive, kind of holistic management style ranchers out in Colorado, and we ran 15,000 acres of range. This is totally different than, like, Vermont. And we also had irrigated meadows, and we did a lot of that stuff too. But the thing is that I could see what an incredible tool animals were, and also, like, in a bid to, like, not spend a lot of time in a tractor, how can we, like, manage our animals so that they can harvest their own food as much as possible during the year and spread their own manure, right? So that we're not hauling the feed to them and feeding them hay and then hauling the poop away and spreading it. Like, instead, let's, like, rotationally graze the landscape. And you can see here, these guys the grazing system is pretty much finished for the year. I actually still have my sheep are sort of grazing a little bit up on the hill, my ewes, but these guys are done grazing, and we're just bale grazing in a pasture. So I have, like, a bale over there, and they just finished this bale over here this morning. So what I'm doing here is essentially, like, avoiding going in the barn as long as possible. Like, this is a great spot because there's no runoff from this. There's no brook, there's no wetlands. This is a very dry, sandy pasture. There's no mud. There's a lot of residual grass here that they're probably not going to eat. And so we're peeing and pooping as much as possible here, so I don't have to go start a tractor and clean it out of the barn and then spread it up here.
Yeah.
Obviously, when the weather gets horrible, or if this gets at all, like, overgrazed or muddy, we'll leave it, go somewhere else on the farm, or we'll go into the corral area.
When will you ultimately put them into the corral for the winter season?
Yeah, well, these guys are probably going to get, we'll keep the best ewe lambs, and then most of these guys are going to get butchered in December. And so the biggest one's in December, and then the second batch will go in January.
So what do you like to carry for a number?
For the winter, I literally just carry my ewes. So it can be from 24 to 30 ewes, and then hoggets, from 3 to 8, depending on kind of what I'm doing with my flock. And so the hoggets, I don't breed until the ewe lambs are about 2. So, I have to keep those guys separate from the rams. But I only put my rams in for, like, 23 days, and whoever doesn't get bred gets butchered. So partly that's because of, like, having a baby, and then having now, she's 3.5 now, so I'm not going to spend 45 days in the lambing barn. Yeah. I'm going to go, like, one heat cycle plus a few days, and then I'm done. Yeah, so hopefully everything goes well up there, and the breeding, I usually only have, like, maybe one open one or something. So it's not usually a big problem. Right. But what I find is, in the past, when I used to leave the rams in a lot longer, all of those ewes that didn't cycle pretty much in the first, 25 days, all had problems. Or there was some issue, like their lambs weren't that frisky, and they, all kinds of things like that. So
this is where being a biology teacher comes in, right?
Well, I just basically looked at all I kept all these records, and so I just went back, and statistically I was like, well, it's not worth having the ram in for more than 25 days anyway, so I'm going to stop doing that. And it's a win-win, because then I can go, back to sleep after 23 days. Right. I'm definitely a hands-on lammer. Like, we lamb in April, early April, first week or two, or first basically 3 weeks of April, and I check the sheep every 3 hours, and at this point I know when I need to intervene or not, but I do my best to keep them alive, because I also have found, as far as financially, it doesn't make all this sense for me to just be like, okay, well, let's just see what happens if I've spent all this time the rest of the year, like, raising these big sheep that have these nice big lambs. I really need to have a very high lambing average in order to make this work financially. So I feel like I try to work my tail off during lambing season to make sure that goes well.
Yeah. So our focus with this podcast is to educate and entice people into farming, because there are not a lot of people who are doing this. So it's especially obviously with sheep and goats we're talking about. And so it seemed a natural fit for us to have you come talk about what type of land, I'm going to start. What am I going to look for? So if someone is looking for land, I believe that a lot of people feel if it's green, you can put an animal on it, right?
Right.
So I'm curious as to if you were looking for a farm, even if it wasn't a big farm, but what would you suggest someone look for so that they could have land to graze animals on?
Sure. Well, for one thing, sheep, really evolved in like high desert, like goats. They don't like wetlands.
Yeah.
And Vermont can be a wet state. This is a very dry part of Vermont, like along Connecticut. Like you can see the water's all down there.
Yeah.
And obviously there's different parts of the state, like Addison County has its clays, the Connecticut River Valley has its sand, and the middle of the state has a lot of rock. Right. So what I would say is that it's important to have actually a variety of pastures in your pasture system, which sort of happens to most people naturally. Like you have some fields that are wetter some years, some fields that are drier some years. Because let's be honest, with climate change and the way our weather also works within that. On wetter years, your drier pastures are going to be more productive, and vice versa on dry years. And so if all of your fields are exactly the same, they're going to be amazing if it's like a dry year, but maybe they'll be horrible in a wet year, or the other way around. So I do think having a variety of things is good. I would say that, especially with sheep and goats, they don't want wet feet. So, you need to fence out wetlands, which is also better for water quality in the state, to keep the poop and the mud, which is like them, going in there, out of the waterways and seasonal ditches and stuff. And then for them it's better because like foot rot is obviously more of a disease that you can catch from other sheep and shepherds, but foot scald and foot issues can be caused from having too wet of ground. And then also, of course, if you have foot rot in your flock, which is something I would recommend eradicating if you think you have it, and you can talk to your vet about that. But if you do have foot rot, it will be also exacerbated by having a lot of wet areas. I also think it's nice for sheep to have, I wish I had more like rocky outcroppings, because I feel like that is very natural for them and is good for their feet. And one problem I do have is my guard donkey, of course, is up the road. Even though she's very friendly and photogenic, usually she's not here. But one thing I have to be careful about with the donkey is that I need to run her in the road for like during the day when I don't have to worry about coyotes as much. I actually close her into the road so that she can be on rock and dry, and also be on a diet, let's be honest. She's a little fat. But like just to prevent laminitis. I wouldn't care normally if she was fat, but we don't want her to die from that. But for her foot health, it is nice for her to be on the road. So that's a whole nother kind of annoying thing to have to manage. Luckily, I have a hard, dry farm road that goes through the middle of my fields. So from both sides, I can like kick donkey out of the field into the road occasionally. I wish I could like kind of do that with the sheep more. But one problem is with the sheep is that I try not to let them dawdle in the road if it hasn't, because of timing. So that's one thing with pasture that's really important. Like, in some ways, I would say, like, with sheep and goats, because of the parasite resistance caused from the overuse of dewormers or the misuse of them, it would be so nice if people could, do less rotations on their field. So, like, here I have, economically to make this sheep business work, I have about a 50-day rotation. So it's like 50 days before I come back to a field, and a lot of the worms do die off, but the problem is depending on the weather that particular year, if like the sheep poops and then it shouldn't hatch for 4 or 5 days, 4 days at the earliest. So like I move my sheep every day or every day and a half. So I subdivide all these fields with nets. But someone who is keeping their sheep in one paddock for like 4 or 5 days during the summer, those parasites are going to hatch. The larvae is going to crawl into the grass, and they could potentially be reinfecting themselves after 4 or 5 days. So that's why it's important that the occupancy, so the time they're in a specific paddock, is 3 days or less is very safe. And it's also better for the grass.
Are you feeling like paddocks should then be reflective of that and be smaller paddocks, so they're better grazers, more selective eaters?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So we can easily do the math, and we can help you size paddocks. And you can also, trial and error, like set a paddock size. If it's way too big for like 3 days, you're just going to have to give up. Don't make them eat that grass, because you could potentially infect them, right? So you're going to have to leave it alone, and then the next time you come through your rotation, hopefully at least 45 days or more, longer, then you're going to want to like resize that paddock so that it's smaller the next time. Now, if it's only a 2-day paddock and you don't want to move your sheep every other day and you want a 3-day paddock, then next time you're going to have to make it. So that's the thing, like even those of us who've been doing this a long time and can, happily do all the math and teach other people to do it, I still, make mistakes. I'm like, oh, this year, field number 4, like I should have divided it into 6 and I divided it into 5. And it was too big, but I thought it would be less grass because it seemed dry, but then it was more grass. And I thought, so this happens to everyone, and it's okay.
Is this the difference between rotational grazing and managed intensive grazing? How is that different? I think of managed intensive grazing as that, watching the grasses and moving when the grass tells you to move.
Yeah, good rotational grazing is dynamic, I would say. People have get stuck on the vocabulary. I was technically raised in holistic management, which is planned grazing, and they say that instead of rotational grazing or instead of MIG grazing or management intensive grazing. Yeah. I think that the important thing is to focus on the occupancy of the paddock, so being there 3 days or less, also for the sake of the grass, because the grass is going to resprout and be big enough to start grazing by the 3rd or 4th day. So you really need to leave before they can graze the regrowth, right? And then how long the rest period is when you return. So when you come back, like I said, if it's a very dry year, you could probably get away with a 45-day rest period, and most of the worms would die off so that you're not then reinfecting them when they come back. But on a wet year, it could be 75 days. Mm-hmm. And so, when someone's buying a property or thinking about how many animals they can have on that property, they really need to think about what's their strategy going to be. Are they going to hay? So that's a great way to kill worms. So if we graze this and then it grew back and then we hayed it, that actually kills a lot of parasites, or most all of them. And then after it regrows, then we come back and we graze it again with the sheep and we divide it up. And of course, when you divide a field correctly or the sheep kind of it's like a good stress. I know everyone thinks stress is bad, but when they go into a paddock that's sized correctly, they're competing with their friends to get things, so they tend to eat more evenly than if they go in and they're just dancing around, eating all of the, strawberry shortcake first. Mm-hmm. And then it's 3 days later, they're oh, there's only kale left. I do love kale chips. So, but anyways, strawberry shortcake's pretty good. Yeah. But you know what I mean. Now, these guys are just dawdling around because they've kind of had all the food they need with hay, and they're sort of just yeah. They also need space, right? So that is one thing for very small producers who have only a handful of sheep. Yeah. It's not like you're going to make a tiny little paddock where it's they can, but maybe that's when you have a 3-day paddock so they can have a little more space. Yeah. Also, there is a strategy where you let them have more space than they need, and I know these guys have all been castrated, but apparently they're feeling the fall vibe.
Yeah, I want those too.
But you know what I mean? So they're, you can let them cream only the best stuff, and not forcing them to eat all that woody stem is going to put more weight on them. So when you graze lambs or growing animals or lactating animals, you want to not push them as hard as you would if you had non-bred sheep that were not,
Yeah.
that didn't have lambs on them. Then you can let them eat a little bit, but you still want to leave a good amount of residual. You can see there's a lot of residual here. And, during the grazing season, the larvae are in the bottom 3 inches. However, snails, which carry meningeal worm, can be 2 feet up in the air. They can be, so that's
And
grazing
that's
avoidance.
a water issue this year.
Right, it's like staying away from wet areas, but also one of the best things to do is try to keep deer out of your field. So dogs, fencing, because deer are really the vector for.
Right. So, what would you? So, I say I'm going to buy a farm. I don't have a lot of land. What would be your advice if someone has one field and they're going to put 2 sheep in it, but they're not going to rotate them? Is that just? I think we should let people know if that's something they should do or shouldn't plan that.
I probably wouldn't do that.
Okay.
It would be really complicated to manage their parasite intake potentially when they're just, that's like set stock grazing, when you just put the animals out and leave them for the whole season. There are some like products that people use. I mean, besides dewormers, so like, Safeguard or Sidectin or something, which, I really recommend the Maryland Small Ruminant Institute, and has tons of information on how to prevent resistance, so you can use dewormers without ruining them. And then also using FAMACHA cards, and then checking, basically mucous membranes like eyelids, and you can check the vulva and also the palate inside the mouth for like basically their anemia level. But you need to actually do the course and use the card. You can't just like do this, because it's not how you do it anyway. You have to really like push the eyeball in and take the course, because it does make a difference. I used to do it the wrong way, and then I learned how to do it the right way, and it is a lot better. And I have, the thing is that when you have a large number of sheep, like say I had 1,000 sheep, it would be like very impossible to do FAMACHA on all those animals. That's a lot of time. So
Seems like 80 would be a lot.
it is a lot. Now I have a chute system, so when I do FAMACHA with these guys, so in the middle of summer you really should do it every 2 or 3 weeks to really stay on top of, and you shouldn't be worming that many. It might be just 10 out of 80 or something. And if you don't do it for a whole month, it's going to be a lot more, right? And so the fewer you can worm in a group, the more refugia, or you have worms that haven't been wormed that are then breeding with the worms that have been wormed to keep the resistance down, right? But there's a lot of strategies. So the other one is, so if you had 2 sheep, they have a product called Worm X, or let me think about that for a minute. It'll come back to me. But it's basically like you're feeding them these pellets that have, I think it's a type of nematode or something. We can look this up. And it actually helps to kill the worms in the soil, and it keeps the worm load down. I don't know how well it really works, but that's definitely a potential. It's just really expensive. Yeah. So a lot of people don't use it on a large scale, like if they have more than 10 sheep, because they would be using so much, and it's quite expensive. And for a while it was like impossible to get. You couldn't even buy it. But that is one strategy people use to sort of more naturally keep the worms down.
I kind of like how people are moving toward the idea of non-chemical.
Right.
There's a non-chemical alternative to that.
Yep.
And my feeling a little bit is, if I understand if you have 1,000 sheep, like you said, but the chemical, the worming of it, there's alternatives.
Sure.
And so the idea of why do I want to do this should include, am I willing to take the time to do it the way it should be done?
Right.
With the best interests of the animals.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and when you have 1,000 sheep or something, you're probably going to really use worm avoidance as the best strategy, so you don't have to worm, because worming takes a lot of time if you do use dewormers, and if you don't, you're going to lose sheep. So, like, the other thing is that you can do is, besides haying, which kills tons of worms because it dries things out, clipping is not the same. So
That's
just for the record, when people mow, all it does is actually kind of insulate the worms, and they can last like a longer time or just as long. It might have no effect, but it doesn't decrease the amount of worms. And they've done lots of studies on it. So Cornell, and you can
So
look.
if you're not going to hay the field, is there a benefit to clipping the field after the sheep come out?
Yeah, sometimes. So I would say that most people overclip. And unless you have like a very high stakes, high producing like dairy level pasture, or you're like trying to finish lambs really fast, that clipping is mostly, if you do the math, it's really not worth it. It's like the time you're spending on the tractor and the fuel you're using doesn't pay for the like little bit of improvement that your sheep are going to have in the next grazing. I would say that it is different if you have some kind of insane invasive, like if you have knapweed, or you're trying to reduce the amount of poison parsnip if you have way too much. I actually think my sheep love poison parsnip. It has a deep taproot, so it does well in a drought. We had so much poison parsnip when I moved here because it all blew in off the highway. And in 5 years, they haven't eliminated it, but there's maybe like not very much left. I don't know, 5%. And it was like a lot of poison parsnip.
Who've done it, not
yeah, they ate it. I didn't do anything. But there are some, very annoying invasives out there, and so you can use clipping as a strategy, maybe like once a year to clip.
Oh, okay.
Or say if you have a lot of bed straw. Sheep also love bed straw, and I actually am sad that my sheep have eaten all our bed straw. But if you have like a haying grazing system where you're switching back and forth, and you want to keep the bed straw down because it doesn't make very good quality hay, you could then clip when it's blooming. But you need to think about clipping as like a grazing time. So like if you're grazing, you need to clip within a few days of grazing, otherwise you're just clipping regrowth. You don't want to clip too short, same as you don't want to graze too short, because then you're damaging the root structure. Also during a drought year, you want to probably skip all clipping so that there's the micro shade, and it's cooler to leave a little extra out there. So that's what I would say about. The other thing is if you want to be sort of like pro bird and pollinators, you want to clip as minimally as possible. So like I know Laura Johnson talks about like if you want to clip your farm to prevent like blackberries and grape. I have a lot of problems with grapes. This is very strange, but they'll grow up right in the middle of the field, so, and they really will take over. So what we try to do here is
make wine.
Yeah, make wine. These are wild grapes, they're very small. Is that you can clip a third of your farm every year. So what that does is you would clip a different third. So you would keep down the blackberries and the sumac and the grapes from kind of taking over your pasture and converting it back to woodland or scrubland. But you would also leave plenty of areas that are unclipped so that birds and wildlife and pollinators can have places where they. Well, the bobolinks are even more complicated, but like, there's a lot of ground nesting bees, and they'll go in like clumps of grass, and they'll go in like hollow stems of stuff. And so, that's a strategy, is just to clip less and clip not everything.
So the ideal grasses, since we're on grasses.
Sure. Yeah.
So I do have to say, so I had Amber come to our pasture, and I loved it because she said, okay, so here's what you have. You have some poverty grass and some sawgrass. And I was like, I don't know, but that does not sound good. Now, we're musicians, so the poverty grass I understand, but
those are like very not technical terms either. UVM would be very disappointing.
Point taken. But what are the ideal, Timothy? I mean, what is our ideal? If we could and start all over again, what would we do?
Well, I would say that diversity is good. So having a little poverty grass, which is basically like native sheep fescues, that's really what those are.
How kind
and
you are,
bent
Amber.
grasses. Having some native grasses, which are very low performing as far as livestock go, is okay and good. We want to have some diversity. And sawgrass or sedges, which is really what that is. Sedges are also not very nutritional, but it's okay to have some. So that's what I would say to people, is like, just like, don't make yourself crazy. Like, and it's good for the sheep also. Sometimes I think if they are eating too much clover, maybe they go eat a little sedge to kind of like, buffer their system. It's kind of like, if you had a bunch of cake, like going and having like a jar of pickles or something.
So I don't know. Like make that part of my farm. Come to our farm. Come to our farm for a little break from the good stuff.
But that said, I think a lot of Vermont hill farms they're very acidic, so they need probably some lime. And they're also very low in fertility, so they probably need some nitrogen.
You talked about getting the nitrogen from clover.
Poop. Yes, and the best way to get nitrogen is actually fixed naturally by clovers because it's less soluble. So people who are adding tons of manure and fertilizer, basically, a lot of that is unfortunately running off and it's just ruining our lakes, rivers, and the ocean because nitrogen obviously is what's causing like algae blooms at Long Island Sound, right? And then phosphorus is causing all the algae blooms in the freshwater lakes and like Champlain and so forth. So all the stuff about, and pasture, of course we want to have like better quality fields. I would say that within reason, like the truth is we know this as sheep farmers, that the budget isn't too good.
Right.
So just be careful that you're not spending money that's going to create a better pasture, but it's not going to actually make you any more money. So maybe a little bit and lime, but you need all those things should only be done with a soil test to make sure that, I've seen people where they added a bunch of stuff, but they never did a soil test first and they added the wrong thing. So it didn't actually help them at all. And they just spent a bunch of money for nothing.
I think a really good thing, and I think you would agree with this, like the clover with the nitrogen, if you have, and you're able to do it. I think people think you have to have big spreaders or, that's what I do. They have a drink, or I do a parade where my husband pulls me around and I just throw it all over the place.
That's the fun. You just need music. You can.
Exactly right.
Yeah, no,
you don't have to,
I
right?
like hand seed this farm. Okay, this is like 24 or 25 acres, right? And I don't do it all at once, but you put on your book on tape and you have a little time to yourself, or your music, whatever, and you go out and spread stuff. Frost seeding works, but it is not, it sometimes takes a while.
So when you're talking frost seeding, are you talking about seeding on top of at the end of the snow season on the
this is actually, no, not on the snow, because sometimes when the snow melts, it sort of runs all the seed to one spot.
Okay.
So actually, this is a great time of year. November is like one of the best times of year to frost seed because you're going around now, and then it has all winter to kind of get pressed down towards the ground.
And sometimes the sheep help with that.
The sheep will help if they're out there, even on fields where you don't have animals. And then, hopefully that it's there. Now, if you don't get it done in November and it snows, then you really need to wait until right when and this is the hard timing in the spring, is like you want to not frosting on top of snow for the most part. Maybe if the snow conditions are just perfect so that the seed will go down instead of sliding off the side. But that's why it's nice to do it now, because then it's like there whenever like the frost happens in the spring. And for frost seeding, you can't frost seed a lot of grasses, because a lot of grasses, like Timothy, the seed is so light and it's so small that it never really gets down there. So Timothy would be a grass that you would only want to use like a drill, or you're either doing a pasture renovation with machinery usually, or it's like someone had a cornfield that you're seeding back to pasture. The first thing you seed, you could put Timothy down with a lot of other stuff like brome. Brome is a great grass to Timothy, orchard grass, but none of those frost seed. The only grass that really frost seeds that well is perennial rye.
So not the clover in a
clover does too. But those are those are legumes. So for the legumes, they actually, a lot of them frost seed great because they're like small, hard, and round, and they sort of fall down. So red clovers are awesome. White clovers, then there's like bird's foot trefoil, which I have to say, bird's foot trefoil is very hard to establish in established pasture, so I wouldn't recommend. It's very expensive, and so for frosting I'd probably avoid it. I'd probably use that more for pasture renovation or like bare soil type scenario. It also doesn't really seem to take unless you have clay soil. So like,
and there's not a lot of clay around.
No, there's pockets of clay here, but not that much. And so you'll see like in Addison County, they'll have 50% bird's foot trefoil, and like you'll work your tail off in central Vermont and you won't get any.
Yep,
and it's just a soil.
Kelly has it. She's got it all. I'm going to send you some pocket grass, Kelly.
And actually bird's foot trefoil, there has been some research done that having a very high amount, I think it's like 50% your pasture, can have a slight reduction in. It's either the sheep are healthier or the worms are fewer, and they're not quite sure which. And so you don't want to be like fooled by that, because it could be just an immunity thing, but it could be a parasite thing because of the tannins and bird's foot trefoil. So, but I would say the other thing you can frost seed is perennial rye does great. Legumes, that also includes like alfalfa and stuff like that, and chicory is expensive, but it also has a hard seed that can fall, and plantain as well. So those are some things that you can frost seed that are, and forbs are great. So chicory and plantain. I mean, I wish we could buy piles of dandelions. They're so good for the sheep, and they're so amazing, but it's very expensive, and probably also because dandelion is so light, it would also be similar where you'd want to put it on bare soil. It would probably never get through all this grass mat.
But it is a myth then. It's a myth that you cannot seed on grass, because I was told one time, if you have grass, you can't grow new grass.
No,
you know
that's not true. The thing is, I would say is that because sheep are light, but in the November, this would be a good time to frost seed out and then let them step it in if they're out here, because they're then forcing it down, and then you're going to get more likely. But clover can sit in the seed bank for a long time. It could be 10 years later that the thing you frost seeded sprouts. So I do think eventually you kind of get that. Probably a lot of the other stuff, I don't think perennial rye would last that long. So what doesn't sprout will eventually just be wasted. The other thing is clovers really need potassium. So there are some things where potassium is very available in wood ash, so you could spread some wood ash. But I just don't want people to obsess over spreading and doing all this, buying a bunch of stuff, and because really if you do a really good job at grazing management, a lot of these things are going to improve drastically. And then the one thing I would say about grazing management is there's a lot of advanced grazers in the state that are I think at some point you get to a certain level and things are really good, and you're but they're not changing at some point. You just kind of plateau, and that's where Alan Williams' ideas about disruptive grazing is important. So if for 30 years you've been moving your sheep every day and you have a 60-day rest period and you're moving them this way, well, you know what? You've been dividing your field this way for years. Let's divide it this way this year. And maybe you want to skip the third paddock and not graze it at all for a year. And then maybe you want to bale graze, and frost seed one of the other paddocks the next fall, but then do a different one the year after. Maybe move your water tanks to a different spot. Those are things that sort of can help keep improving for those people who are really at a high level.
So what would you say about, I know that improving your land, we're talking about, so how long do you want to keep your sheep out, and how soon do we put them back on the field once they've been taken off the field?
Yeah, so these guys, partly because they were sheared in October and they don't have the wool that my ewes have, because my ewes only get sheared, in March before lambing. So these guys, they're not going to be out here in January because they just don't have enough wool. So they'll eventually have access to the barn. Plus they're going to get butchered in December and January anyway. But at some point here, especially if I feel like they're doing damage on the field, and usually, bale grazing is best done in some places like Addison County, probably only if it's frozen and there's snow on it, and that's to protect it. It's a lot different here because this is 70 feet of sand. I'm not saying you can't compact sand. It can be compacted and so forth, but the main thing I'm lacking here is organic matter, and so I'm adding a lot of organic matter and seed with the bale grazing that I need really bad. So it depends a lot on your soils. I would say no one in Vermont should be having their animals on pasture in March and April. April, I see a lot of people turn out too early. Maybe the very end of April if you're very southern Vermont and things are really you have 10 inches of grass growing. But April is when the grass needs a chance to get its solar panel and its sugars going and take care of its roots. And March is a time when the frost is coming out, when if we're standing on it, we're essentially compacting it extra. So, we get free decompaction every spring, so it's good to let that happen and not be there. So that's when, also for sheep, if you're on sort of a traditional sheep schedule, you're shearing in February and March and you're lambing in April and May, and so most people after they shear, their sheep are not out in the field. They're in a corral in a barn. They can go outside, but they have option of a roof. And then for lambing, if you're not lambing on pasture, you're lambing in jugs in a barn, and so you're not on pasture. You know what I mean? Right. So But yeah, my ewes who have, a full coat of wool, I actually have them in like this high dry pasture over there where I have a hydrant, and they usually stay out until mid-January, and then I put them in a field where it's just more convenient to get to them if there's an issue when I'm getting closer to shearing and stuff. And so then they go down towards where the barn is, and they get sort of confined into part of the field that I think is the drier part, and then we feed them bales out there. And the fields have improved so much from bale grazing here. Like, it's the number one thing that has made a huge difference for my this farm is we've bale grazed very strategically, but it's because I'm basically getting the most bang for my buck. All of the hay that's wasted is actually like compost, right? It's like mulch, it's fertility, it's seed.
And also you were saying that their urine,
yes,
we know their poop is, but I didn't realize that the urine is productive.
Yeah, for sure. So, all of that is making a difference. But like I said, in Addison County it's a little different because the clay and the compaction, so you have to be careful.
Also, too, I find if you're reading about various pastures and things, you have to be careful about who you're reading and where they're farming, because what we have here, the hillside, is very different. Yeah, and you can apply some of this stuff. Like, some people will have a super rocky pasture that's like literally like just a rocky pasture, and that is a great place to also bale graze or outwinter, because they're going to do very little damage if it's very hard and it's rocky already, and it's not going to be too bad for their feet, because you do not want mud. Mud is so bad. It's bad for your land. It's bad for water quality, like when it rains and the mud goes, right? Yeah. And it's also really bad for your sheep. Like, if they're walking around in more than a little tiny bit of mud, it's not good for their feet. Yeah. So. And what do you do if, like, in your paddocks and things? Sure. Well, I don't have any mud in my fields. But if you do, like, then I take them out. Okay. Like, if they start making a mud spot here, we're done here. Yeah. Yeah, and I like try to catch it before it gets there. And then as far as my corral and stuff, we use like a wood chip bedded pack outside. And there is tons of really great resources, like, for farmers. There's grants out there to do a lot of this stuff. So if you need help with your barnyard, if you need help with temporary fencing to do a better rotation, or if you need permanent fence, there's like all kinds of grants out there. There's federal, so there's NRCS, there's state, there's PSWF, there's SEEP grants that help pay for equipment, like to seed drills, bale choppers. There's all kinds of interesting stuff out there. AFT, American Farmland Trust, has there's micro grants, there's bigger grants. So there's definitely help out there, because, the truth is these guys are paying their hay bill, and they're paying for some of my time, but they're not paying for a new fence, unfortunately. Or redoing your corral. No, they're not. They're not paying for that. No. And so there are payments for doing a good job rotationally grazing. And so I try to use, like, or the sheep, the sheep get paid for grazing the solar array right up there. So, then I can use that money to, like, improve sheep housing. But I try to really, like, pay attention to the budget there, because obviously, like, we want to keep farming. Right. And you have to make it. Yeah. So there's a lot of woodland, right? We can see it, right? And what about that as far as animals browsing and things? Do you recommend that for short-term pasturing? Like, do you put them into their woodlands, or I know foresters, it's a little bit of a... Yeah, so there's all kinds of rules. So you just want to make sure that you're not in a wetland and that you're in compliance with your current use, because you don't want to, like, get kicked out of current use and have to pay fines, or like lose that sort of tax break that farmers get. So that is one thing. I think that, like, agroforestry, so there's like different aspects of agroforestry, or different like ways of thinking about it. There's people planting trees into fields, which I've done. You can see up there, there's a grove of trees I planted, and then I have some random ones here, and there's some strips in other fields. So I'm hoping to have more of a silvopasture here over time. So those trees are like a source of shade, so that I can have a rotation where I'm dividing things differently, because I have more shade options. Because I think shade is really critical, especially as our summers get hotter. Like, animals that are overheated don't grow.
They don't make you any money. They die, they abort, they have all kinds of problems. And so, and it's just not nice for them, frankly. They need shade. And one of the things is pastures that have a lot of tall forage. So say it's been 60 days since I come back and there's a lot of grass here. That for a sheep, in some ways, it's almost like shade for them, and the ground's going to be cool. So when they lay down, it's like cooling, right? Especially when they lay down, you can hardly even see them, right? So that's almost like shade. Depends on how hot it is. I would say that they still really would like to have shade. But
you did photograph my sheep shed that I
oh yes, yeah. So one thing that's really cool is people who have night folds, or people who have shade structures that are mobile. They are annoying and they're a lot of extra work for people sometimes. However, you can use them as a tool. So like if you have a really infertile, like horrible part of your pasture, you can park that shed there or that shade structure, and then they are going to pee and poop there a lot extra, and then you can reseed that spot. And so you can use it as like a fertility tool in your field. So that means you don't want to park it on top of your pond, right? And you want to park it like where it's just like poor growth or whatever. But so with the animals in the forest, I would say that obviously sheep like to browse, like goats browse the most, but sheep and cows actually browse quite a bit. But I would say that the productivity of, like, if you just put them in the woods, they're probably only getting like 50 pounds the acre, like as far as dry matter. So they're really not getting hardly anything, unless we're talking like scrubland where everything's small. And they're pretty destructive. So like you wouldn't want to put them into a really nice woodlot. So I would say, like, I would stick to the edge, like 50 feet in, sure. Like you know, give them an extra 50 feet of woods on the edge of their fields around so you can use it for shade. But just putting them in the woods isn't like, definitely that's not silvopasture or, you know, agroforestry. That's just like sheep in the woods. For real agroforestry systems where like you convert woodland to pasture, that's very complicated. It's actually probably easier to plant trees into fields than to cut
fields into pasture.
Cut woods and make them into pasture. So that, I think you would want like the help of an agroforestry specialist and a forester to like do it right, and to actually have something that they're going to eat. Like you need to have things that are going to sprout, like willows and mulberries and stuff like that they can eat, that's like going to create browse.
Yeah. So I'd love to know a final tip on or on the land or on grazing tips that you think is an essential. Like, what is the essential for anyone who's farming or would like to farm?
Well, temp fence. I mean, some people do have permanent paddocks where they'll have like 12 paddocks and they do like 3 days in each one. And that works okay, but for cows, for sheep, think about that, 3 days in each one, you're coming back and you're just not gone long enough, right? It's like 33 days of rest or something. So I would say rest, like concentrating on that, and also keeping track of what you're doing. Like I have a grazing chart and I like write what I think I'm gonna do, and then I write what I actually do, and that's really helpful, especially like 2 years later when you're like, was I in that field for 5 days last year, and how many sheep did I have then? Oh, I had 45 sheep and I was in there for 7 days. Like, it's really helpful for planning, so you don't end up grazing yourself into a corner, right? Just like bees, they die at the end of the winter. You're just going to feed hay, and I can tell you that nothing will burn your farm budget like hay. And so, you know, you want to really like make sure that you're not overstocked. Understocking is way better than overstocking. So having fewer sheep than you could have on your fields gives you a lot more. You know, if there's a flood or if there's a drought or if there's, you know, you break your leg, whatever, like it's definitely easier to manage the repercussions of too few sheep than too many. And I would say like too many is going to break your budget more than not having enough product. You know what I mean? Because of the hay costs, or disease pressure too from being sort of overstocked. So yeah, and I would say like concentrating on mobile water system. Like I have water lines that go along my fences and all my fields, and I have water points where I can hook up water tanks. So not hauling water by hand is like really important. I know some people love water wagons and they can work in some very small situations, but I would say hauling water, unless you have like just a few sheep and you just have like a half a 5-gallon bucket you're carrying, that having a water system is like key to having a good, rotational grazing system.
And water being so important.
Yes, and water. It should be clean and it shouldn't be hot.
But warm, don't they prefer?
Well, I think it's fine as long as it's not like, because sometimes when you have a pipeline, if you mow it, it's going to be hot because it's going to get heated up in the sun. So I like to put mine in the woods if I can, or let the grass grow over it so that it shades it. And if you have big enough tanks, they'll sort of fill, and then they don't drink that fast. You can also have water storage. So I pump water up the hill and then I gravity feed it down. There's a lot of there's so many cool and awesome farm hacks for different types of water systems. There's solar water systems, there's, gravity ones, there's springs in the woods, there's, some very cool stuff. Yeah. And then you can use your water tank as a tool too, move it to some place you want animals to congregate. Use your mineral feeder, put it opposite to your water, or park it on a patch of weeds, whatever. You can, use all of your things as a tool. Yeah. Your shade, your nightfold, your bale feeders. Yeah. I always park them on top of thistle patches, or I have some toxic fescue here. It's probably brought in when they put the road in for the solar array years ago. So,
Amber, thank you so much. Tell us just quickly about how we can connect with you, or how we can get someone to come onto our fields, or if we're looking at a field and get some help. How do we do that?
Yeah, so UVM, basically there's people besides UVM for sure. We're pretty much like a free service, so we can come visit your farm and make maps for you, help you come up with your stocking rate, help you kind of judge your fields and come up with a pounds per acre kind of guesstimate. Help you with some, sort of rotational grazing plans and management type, thoughts. There's private grazing consultants. There's tons of great books out there. Sarah Flack has a great book. And the state also has some really good programs to help with water quality issues and fencing. And I think they have a grazing specialist now. That's right. And so there's definitely some great people out there who, are free. And then there's some that you can pay for yourself, or there's some programs that will pay some, I think if you're in farm viability, you can get a consultant to help you come do grazing stuff, and that program pays for it. So there's so many great options.
And that's really important, especially since there's so many different size farms. That's what I love about the opportunity, and especially in Vermont, is you find so many different sizes of the farms.
Yeah, and with a whole host of their own really cool farm hacks for stuff and discoveries, and also challenges, of course. It's always a new problem to solve.
Yeah. So. Well, we've been talking this afternoon with Amber Reed for the VSGA podcast, Why Wool? Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Kelly Oddie. I'm Melissa Pearley.